beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Josh Babarinde.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's an honour to lead this debate on domestic abuse offences, and a particular honour to do so from the very spot in which I witnessed or saw given the most moving speech that I've ever seen in the House of Commons. It was in 2016, November-December time, and it was given by Michelle Thompson, who was then the independent Member of Parliament for Edinburgh West. And she spoke about her experience of abuse, being a victim of violence at the hands of a man. And at the end of that speech, she said, "I am not a victim, I am a survivor." And those words sent a shiver down my spine, gave me goosebumps, and unlocked in me a real determination to try to use my own experience and my family's experience to try to improve what life is like for victims and survivors across the country. And I say in Michelle Thompson's words that I too am not a victim, but I am a survivor. Yeah. And as a result of that, and also my mum's experience at the hands of a former partner of hers, we know what domestic abuse looks like. I know what it is to be crying upstairs under the covers as a child, listening to shouting, screaming, smashing, and the rest coming from downstairs and not knowing if mum was okay. I know what it is to go downstairs the morning after and see broken glass or a kicked-in Hoover and the rest, and to not know whether mum was okay. I know what it is to live in a household where you're worried that any word that you say, any movement that you do, any thought that you might have can be attacked by an abuser in your own home who's meant to keep you safe and who you are meant to trust. There are so many people across our country who are victims and survivors of domestic abuse and other forms of abuse. And it's estimated that 1 in 5 people will be a victim or a survivor of domestic abuse in their lifetimes. And in my view, the law does not go far enough to protect people in those circumstances. Great progress was made in 2021 by the last Parliament in the form of the Domestic Abuse Act, which defines domestic abuse in the law for the first time. It also created a series of domestic abuse aligned offences like coercive and controlling behaviour, non-fatal strangulation, non-fatal suffocation. But I'm afraid that that piece of legislation, and indeed our legislative framework overall, does not go far enough to recognise the domestic abuse that my family has experienced and that many members of this House will be familiar with too. And an example of a failing in the law has existed in the form of the experience undergone by an extremely brave and inspirational survivor, Elizabeth Hudson. Yeah, yeah. Elizabeth was a victim, a survivor of domestic abuse at the hands of her ex-husband. He, among many other terrible acts at home, held a knife to her throat. In response, he was convicted of assault occasioning actual bodily harm, ABH, for his crimes. And for her and for so many, such a conviction does not reflect the full gravity, the full circumstances of such a nefarious crime. And that's led to all sorts of problems, not just for Elizabeth, but for many other survivors as well.
On that point?
Of course, I will take his intervention.
Madam Speaker, can I first of all commend the gentleman for Eastbourne for his courage and telling the story, a very personal story. I think we all are particularly moved by it. I know I am, and I thank him for that. He's shown himself to be a very determined, capable member of Parliament, and I wish him well. Across Northern Ireland, we are witnessing people being arrested for first-time domestic offences. Ultimately, we say that in court these charges are not prosecuted and the case is dropped. Fast forward and people are re-arrested for domestic charges that are in fact worse, showing a pattern of escalating violence. Does the honourable member agree with me that arrests for domestic abuse must be fully investigated and, if proven, must be prosecuted to the full extent of the law to protect people out there from violence and to instil confidence in our judicial system? Thank you.
Babarinde.
I thank the honourable member, my friend, the member for Strangford, for his intervention and for his kind words. And I completely agree that all abusers, domestic or not, must face the full force of the law. It's critical for that to happen in order for victims and survivors to have confidence in the police and our wider criminal justice system. And that is what is lacking among many victims and survivors. And we can see it, say, in the form of some of the consequences of the STS-40 early release scheme that the government had to implement in light of the poor state that the last government left our prisons in. Of course, I will.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you to the member for Eastbourne for bringing forward this debate. It's such an important one. Does he agree with me that one of the challenges of the current system is often domestic abusers and perpetrators are convicted of a single act, when in fact domestic abuse happens over many years and can vary in the types of attacks and abuse that happen, and therefore convicting them for the totality of the abuse becomes quite difficult, and often the prosecution will go for the easiest single act to convict, and thereby things like early release, but also the length of their incarceration doesn't reflect the amount of abuse that their victim survivor actually has had to endure.
Josh Babarinde.
Yeah, I thank the honourable member for her intervention, and she's absolutely right that domestic abuse is more than just an act. It is a campaign of abuse, a campaign of misery, and a campaign of an abuse of power by one or more people against another. And that's what makes it so difficult to convict. But there's so many areas in which the law could do better. And I was speaking about the early release scheme as an example, the scheme being one in which folks who were released would serve 40% of their sentence rather than 50% of their sentence. And the government very nobly made a commitment to survivors that it would do everything possible to exclude domestic abusers from being released early under the STS-40 scheme, recognising that it can be super destabilising for survivors who need to prepare for when their abuser is back in society, back in their community, back in their neighbourhood. But unfortunately, we know that there are many domestic abusers who were released early under the STS-40 scheme. And it happened because the only way in which you can exclude someone or include someone within an early release scheme is on the basis of the offence that they've committed. This is something that the Justice Secretary has confirmed, and not on the basis of anything else that we might know about their behaviour. But the problem is there is no specific offence of domestic abuse in the law. We therefore cannot properly exclude those people from such an early release scheme if that's something that we're committing to those survivors. Instead, we know, just a second, I will take his point. Instead, we know that domestic abusers are often convicted of ABH or assault or battery, and these are offences that were criminalised by an act that was written in 1861, the Offences Against the Person Act, which is not written with domestic abuse in mind. As a result, there are so many domestic abusers who are falling through the cracks, Madam Deputy Speaker. So many victims and survivors who don't get the justice or recognition they deserve. I will take his intervention.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and I would also like to thank him for bringing this debate to the House. I congratulate him for doing so. He's a colleague on the Justice Select Committee. Does the honourable member believe that in looking at domestic violence, we are likely to give it more attention, because often victims of domestic violence are women, if domestic violence were to be classified as domestic abuse? Does he think that that might make a difference in getting more attention to domestic violence cases? Thank you.
Josh Babarinde.
I thank my colleague for the Justice Select Committee for his intervention. And of course, domestic violence is a form of domestic abuse, but we must also remember that domestic abuse covers so many different kinds of activity. Emotional abuse, financial abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, all sorts. And it's critical that we give recognition to all of those, because all too often there's a disproportionate recognition of, say, physical violence, but not some of the more hidden forms of abuse that are just as damaging to victims and survivors. I will take her point.
Thank you for giving way, and thank you, the honourable member, for calling this debate on an issue that is incredibly important. I've got my notes in front of me because I've raised this statistic before, but actually in Staffordshire, I'm the MP for Stafford, Eccleshall and the Villages. Women's Aid Staffordshire is based in my constituency, and we've seen a 361% increase in referrals to their sexual violence service over recent years, and an 851% increase in referrals to their specialist counselling services. Does the honourable member agree with me that we are facing a national crisis?
I thank her for sharing that point, and more than a national crisis, this is a national emergency, and Women's Aid have rightfully declared it so. And that's why it's more important now than ever that our legal framework properly recognises domestic abuse in the law. So I've described how our current legislation, in my view, is leaving survivors without the respect and without the protection that they deserve. So many of survivors' abusers, for example, qualifying for early release when they shouldn't be under what the government has intended. Now, I've raised this a number of times in this House and beyond. I've raised it on the Justice Select Committee. And Ross Gribbin, who is a Director General at the Ministry of Justice, confirmed that the only way of correcting this, the only way of closing this loophole, is through primary legislation. Legislation that this House must debate and must vote on. And so that leads us to think about what kind of solutions are there to patching up what is a legal loophole. The solution must be to create a specific offence of domestic abuse in the law. I've proposed a very specific way of doing that in consultation with a number of stakeholders, and that is to create a series of domestic abuse aggravated offences in the law. So in the same way that we have racially and religiously aggravated ABH, GBH, assault, etc., we would have a domestic abuse aggravated equivalent. And Thanks,
McIntyre.
Thank you. I thank the honourable member for giving way, making a powerful speech on a subject that I know matters to so many people in this House. On this point of aggravated offences, will you agree with me that not just on offences, but we must also look at sentencing? I know, for example, Killed Women are campaigning to change the gap on sentencing between women who are murdered at home. Their perpetrators receive a lower sentence than if you were murdered on the street, and actually having domestic abuse related aggravated offences when it comes to sentencing would end that injustice entirely. Thank you.
Josh Babarinde.
I thank him for making that point. And the law is already going some way to help achieve that. So domestic abuse is already an aggravating factor in sentencing at the back end, but is not an aggravating factor at the front end in terms of the offence that people can be convicted of. And we know there's precedent to make something like this happen, to create these domestic abuse aggravations, because the Crime and Disorder Act was an act that introduced racially that introduced a number of aggravations, and it was extended to include racially and religiously aggravated aggravations. And so we ought to amend that specific piece of legislation to include this in it as well. But this is about far more than just early release schemes, for example, and being able to include or exclude domestic abusers from those schemes. This is also about data. I asked a written parliamentary question to the Ministry of Justice. It was a very simple question just before Christmas. And the question was, how many domestic abusers are currently in prison, and what is their reoffending rate? The response was this: it is not possible to robustly calculate the number of domestic abusers in prison or their reoffending rate. This is because these crimes are recorded under the specific offences for which they are prosecuted. I.e., we don't know how many domestic abusers there are because there is no specific offence of domestic abuse in the law. Instead, they're convicted of offences, for example, under the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act. This is a national scandal. We should know how many domestic abusers there are in prison. And in fact, the government has a really powerful ambition that I fully support to halve violence against women and girls over the next decade. But how can we possibly know if we're achieving that, if we don't know how many domestic abusers are in prison at any given time? And more than that, if we're serious about reducing reoffending, and I've dedicated my career before coming into this place to do exactly that kind of work, how can we know what kind of interventions are most successful when it comes to reducing reoffending if we don't have a way of measuring it, because there is no specific offence of domestic abuse in the law?
On that note,
of course.
I commend you for speaking so eloquently and movingly about the Honourable Member's personal experiences. Madam Deputy Speaker, there's a recognised link between animal abuse and domestic abuse, and I pay tribute to organisations such as the Link Group, which train veterinary professionals to recognise when cases they are seeing may be indicators of abuse, domestic abuse. And it ties in exactly to what the Honourable Member is saying, that if there isn't a specific crime of domestic abuse, it is really hard to signpost and give guidance to everyone in the community to be able to know how to proceed forward to ensure that people are identified early and helped at a very early stage.
I completely agree with the Honourable Member for Winchester. We know that there are links between domestic abuse and animal abuse. We also know that there are links between domestic abuse and child sexual abuse, for example. This is a link that I have experienced the hard way. But again, our legislation and the data that we're collecting is not helping us in as far a way as it could to help us make that link so that we can figure out which interventions will be best at busting these social ills. There are more reasons why a specific offence of domestic abuse is so critical. Let's take Clare's Law. Clare's Law being the scheme that allows individuals, but mostly women, to request to see information about the offending histories of their partners. They get to see things like the charges that individual has been subjected to, or the offences that they've been convicted of if they qualify for the scheme. It would be very easy for an abusive partner to explain away a conviction or a charge for assault or battery as a brawl between them and a stranger in a pub, say. But can you explain away domestic abuse aggravated assault in the same way? No. Of course.
I'd like to thank my honourable friend, Madam Deputy Speaker, for such a powerful speech and for his courage and leadership on this matter. He asked about the ways in which the perpetrators of domestic abuse might hide their crimes. And I have to say, in my constituency of Bristol and Woodstock, I've heard too many examples of women who are suffering abuse but are not finding a way to cut through to the authorities. Will my honourable friend agree with me that too often cuts to victim support and an inaccessibility of legal aid is preventing those who are the victims of domestic abuse from actually being able to start the process that might ultimately lead to the kinds of aggravated offences that he is so rightly calling for?
He's absolutely right. It's critical at a time like now where we've heard about the scale of the national emergency when it comes to domestic abuse, just how important it is that victim support organisations are adequately funded. And I've met with a number of organisations, take victim support as an example, that in light of cuts to PCC core funding, but also the national insurance contribution increase, that they're facing a 7% real terms cut in their funding. We should be funding these organisations more, not less at this time, to support constituents like the very ones that my honourable friend has mentioned. Now, there might be some challenges to the proposal that I'm putting forward, and a challenge that was put to me is that, Josh, might this not lead to the very sentencing inflation that the government is trying to avoid now to ensure that our prisons don't fill up so quickly? My response to that is twofold. The first thing is that domestic abuse, as we've explored already in this debate, is already an aggravating factor in sentencing. It already carries a greater sentence. What I'm proposing is that we enhance the front end, as I said earlier, not just at the back end. The second response I have is that if we look at the crime and policing bill that the government put before this House very recently, and we had our second reading of the bill last week, there are a number of brand new offences that are created in that bill, offences that I completely agree with and commend the government on. Things like assault of a shop worker or a dedicated offence of spiking. These are the right things to do. But if we can do them for those crimes, surely we can do them for the crime of domestic abuse. And I remember in that debate for the crime and policing bill, there are a number of honourable members, but particularly on the government side, who praised the trade unions for their campaigning to get this offence of assault against a shop worker over the line. And I agree that great campaigning by trade unions helped to achieve that. But domestic abusers, or their survivors and their victims, do not have such a union. We in this House are their union, which is why we must campaign for a dedicated offence of domestic abuse to protect them. Now, I'm really pleased, I'm really proud that there are so many who have rallied around this proposal to create a specific set of domestic abuse offences in the law. They include Women's Aid, they include Mankind, they include Refuge, they include Victim Support, and many more charities and support organisations in this space who believe that this needs to be done. I'm really grateful to many of my Liberal Democrat colleagues who are sat around me for backing this proposal, but also those across this House, and particularly thankful to those members on the government benches who have privately reached out to me to express their support for these proposals. And I know a number of them have expressed that support to their front bench as well. And I'm very grateful to lots of our media outlets for getting behind this and for platforming this campaign as well. In particular, the team at Good Morning Britain, who helped me launch this campaign and this very bill that I have in my hand to make this offence closer to reality. And I also thank lots of the very warm and constructive conversations that I've had with ministers, including the Minister for Victims, including the Minister for Safeguarding, who I met with a couple of weeks ago, including the Minister for Prisons, the Lord Timpson, but also the exchanges I've had with the likes of the Solicitor General and the Secretary of State for Justice in this chamber. I really appreciate that constructiveness, but I'm really keen now for even more than warm words. I'm keen for action. Victims and survivors need and deserve the recognition that a creation of a brand new specific offence of domestic abuse in the law would create, and I stand ready to work with literally anyone in this chamber and beyond to make it a reality. Thank you.
I call Sarah Russell.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you very much to the member for Eastbourne who spoke so movingly and so convincingly. I wanted to raise this evening the case of one of my constituents who has come to me with multiple problems from her abusive husband. He is not yet her ex-husband, and the reason he is not her ex-husband is that he is stalling the divorce process, he is hiding assets, and he is dissipating assets. I worked briefly in family law, so I know that this is by no means an unusual situation, and in most cases, it is the man who is involved in perpetrating this sort of thing. In any other situation, what I am seeing here, if it was, for instance, between two business partners, would be prosecuted as fraud. But when it goes on through the family courts, and it goes on through the family courts all the time, it's not prosecuted at all. It's just treated as one of those things. Now, Section 76 of the Serious Crime Act 2015 did create the offence of controlling or coercive behaviour in an intimate or family relationship. And one of the examples of coercive or controlling behaviour is economic abuse, including coerced debt, controlling spending, and those sorts of activities. But actually here, he's no longer directly controlling or coercing her because they are separated. He's just spending all of their money, and she can't stop it. So one of the issues with economic abuse that therefore isn't really dealt with is offences relating to deliberately dissipating someone else's assets. And many, many victims of domestic abuse have their personal finances ruined in the course of their relationships. And one of the things that is a real problem with this at the moment is that any sort of insolvency solution that might help them to rebuild their finances involves having their home address and other personal details published online in the insolvency register. This is deterring a lot of people from getting involved in the insolvency solutions that would enable them to start to rebuild their finances and so their lives. You can apply, one can, apologies Madam Deputy Speaker, one can apply to withhold those details of addresses and so forth, but it involves paperwork, it involves possible court proceedings, and it involves a fee of £300, which is a huge amount of money for someone who's already in an insolvency process. There's a strong argument that we need to reform this process and potentially make the insolvency register private. So I'd just like to finally take an opportunity to say thank you very much to the member for Eastbourne for bringing this debate, but also thank you to my Cheshire Without Abuse who do work on this area in my constituency, and also to the Money Wellness Service who people can engage with if they are having difficulties in this area. I will give way.
Jim Shannon.
A little bit of this just brought to my mind a circumstance that I've witnessed as I'd like to represent over the last few years. It's been the case of a man and a woman, a relationship, husband and wife. He, on a number of occasions, not he himself, but on a number of similar occasions, got a loan out on a joint account on behalf of his wife. And then when the relationship fell apart and all the money in the bank was away, she was left with the loan. So not that she was done over twice. There's an example of something I believe that the Honourable Gentleman is referring to that could be sorted out in this law as well, and I thank her for bringing that forward.
Thank you very much. And yes, I have seen instances like that within my own social circle. It's not unusual, and a lot of the people involved appear to be people who would have, engaged with the bank or whatever, and I know that banks do have some safeguards around this sort of thing now, but actually they're not adequate, and it's often people are being left in terrible financial situations. So yeah, I would just like to say thank you very much to the member for Eastbourne and good luck with this campaign.
I call Minister Alex Davies-Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I first congratulate the Honourable Member for Eastbourne on securing this important debate this evening. And I would like to thank my honourable friend for his commitment to tackling domestic abuse. His leadership is not just political. It is deeply personal and shaped by his own experiences, and now drives his advocacy for better support for victims and survivors. His dedication is truly inspiring. Only through working in partnership across government and society will we succeed in tackling domestic abuse and halving violence against women and girls. My honourable friend's passion, dedication and personal commitment to this cause shines a light on the challenges faced by victims and survivors, and I look forward to continuing to work with him. As the House will be aware, this government was elected on a landmark pledge to halve violence against women and girls over the next decade. And driving down domestic abuse is right at the heart of that pledge. For too long, the justice system hasn't been working for domestic abuse victims. We know the reports are higher than they were 5 years ago, whilst prosecutions are lower. That is unacceptable. We have taken swift action to begin reforming the system, to better support victims and to ensure that they have access to justice. Across government, we are taking steps to improve the justice system's response to domestic abuse, from the first time someone calls the police to court, all the way through to the way that perpetrators are managed after a sentence. We have introduced domestic abuse specialists in 999 call centres in selected areas so that when a victim calls the police, specialists can support first responders to assess the risk and make sure that there is an appropriate response. The CPS and NPCC have launched the Domestic Abuse Joint Justice Plan, which brings police and prosecution experts together for a stronger, more coordinated approach to investigating and charging domestic abuse, so that we get better outcomes for victims. At the court stage, we've taken swift action to tackle delays by funding over 108,500 sitting days at the Crown Court this financial year, and next year we will fund Crown Courts to run at a record level of 110,000 sitting days. We need to do this to tackle the outstanding caseload, and we have commissioned Sir Brian Leveson to recommend once-in-a-generation reform for our criminal courts, and he will report in spring this year. We're making sure that domestic abuse victims can access legal aid throughout the court process by changing the means test, recognising that while victims may own property or be listed as a tenant, they are often unable to benefit from the home if their abuser still lives there. And we're taking action to ensure that survivors of domestic abuse and their children are better protected in the family courts. We're expanding the Pathfinder pilots, which are helping to ensure that children's voices are heard in each case, reducing their trauma and providing more access to specialist support.
Will my honourable friend give way?
I will happily give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I thank the member for Eastbourne for bringing a really important debate. I absolutely agree that no more needs to be done in the family court, and I welcome what's been done so far. But I wonder if my honourable friend will agree with me that also we need to look at the rules around presumption of contact, particularly for children children where domestic abuse is involved, and we need to make sure that we update that in order to make sure that we get away from the assumption that contact with an abuser is advantageous to a child's welfare.
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention. He is a tireless campaigner on this issue, and to echo the words of the Prime Minister, the family court should never be allowed to be used as a means for an abuser to continue their abuse, and this government will be reporting on the issue of presumption soon. We need to ensure that the severity of domestic abuse is captured in our sentencing framework. We've committed to implementing 2 of the outstanding recommendations made in Claire Wade's domestic homicide sentencing review to make murders involving strangulation and those connected with the end of relationship statutory aggravating factors. And we are further strengthening our response through improved management of perpetrators. We've launched domestic abuse protection orders in selected areas, combining the strongest elements of other orders to protect victims from all forms of domestic abuse. This puts tough restrictions on abusers and can include orders for behaviour change programmes to finally stop that cycle of abuse from repeating. And since February, offenders sentenced for 12 months or more for coercive or controlling behaviour are now automatically eligible for management under multi-agency public protection arrangements. This rightly puts the response of this awful offence on par with physical violence. Alongside our work to tackle offending, we are strengthening protection for victims. Our new Victims Code will help to ensure that every victim of crime, including domestic abuse, understands their rights and will make sure that we can properly monitor the service local agencies are offering. The duty to collaborate will also improve how local commissioners commission services for domestic abuse victims. We're also increasing the power of the Victims Commissioner so that there is more accountability when victims are let down by the system. On funding, we are continuing to prioritise support for victims and survivors of abuse. Police and crime commissioners are provided with funding to commission local, practical, emotional and therapeutic support services for victims of all crime type, including domestic abuse. The criminal justice system is facing considerable demand pressures and a challenging fiscal environment. Difficult decisions have been made regarding funding, but we have continued to prioritise violence against women and girls victims by protecting that spending in the Ministry of Justice, maintaining last year's funding levels for sexual violence and domestic abuse support this year. This will ensure that domestic abuse and sexual violence support services can continue their vital work. And that is on top of the core funding that we give to police and crime commissioners to allocate locally. And I should stress that we are encouraging police and crime commissioners to prioritise violence against women and girls victims in their budgets. Our work to tackle domestic abuse and better support victims will require a cross-government approach. We've already heard this evening how important it is to include DEFRA, to include the Treasury, financial services. We will use every lever in our power and work with key partners across government to deliver against this ambition. I am proud to co-chair the Violence Against Women and Girls Mission Board, which brings together mission ministers from across government with responsibility for this to drive forward delivery of our mission. I've also been engaging extensively across Whitehall on prevention and early intervention, as well as on wider support that victims of domestic abuse need, such as safe housing provision or support for their pets. All of our important work will be underpinned by a new strategy to combat violence against women and girls, which we will publish later this year. Now, turning to my honourable friend's particular interest in, as he sets out, to create a cohort of domestic abuse offenders in order to exclude those offenders from early release measures. As my honourable friend knows, SDS 40 was an emergency measure introduced to avert a prison capacity crisis that this government sadly inherited. However, we did make sure to exclude certain offences from this change, including sex offences, irrespective of sentence length, serious violent offences with a sentence of 4 years or more, and a series of offences linked to domestic abuse, including stalking, coercive or controlling behaviour, and non-fatal strangulation. Exclusions from the policy, as my honourable friend has said, are based on offences, not offenders. This means that it has not been possible to exclude all offenders with a domestic abuse history, as there is no current single means of determining whether a given conviction was for an offence committed in the context of domestic abuse. I am hugely sympathetic of the issues my honourable friend has raised this evening. However, I am not convinced that his particular solution to create that series of domestic abuse aggravated offences is the right one. But I am concerned about the unintended consequences of attempting to capture and define via a list of specific offences the full spectrum of offences in which domestic abuse could be a factor. As we've heard this evening, it is very vast. I'm extremely wary that attempting to do so could unwittingly create a system in which some offences are deemed serious enough to constitute offences which could be aggravated by domestic abuse, whereas other offences in which domestic abuse could play a part are not. We should not, for example, return to the outdated view that domestic abuse only involves physical violence. As my honourable friend, the member for Congleton, has already said, economic abuse should also be taken into consideration, and that will also be a core part of this government's violence against women and girls strategy. This government is dedicated to ensuring that the harm caused by offences typically committed against women and girls, including domestic abuse, is appropriately and proportionately reflected in the sentencing framework. That is why the sentencing review, chaired by former Lord Chancellor David Gauke, has been asked to specifically look at the sentences for offences primarily committed against women and girls. I do recognise that being able to better to identify domestic abuse offenders throughout the system, to capture that data, is important in supporting victims and managing perpetrators. I will happily give way.
Thank her for giving way and for her response and for her feedback as well. And I appreciate that setting a static list of offences to which a domestic abuse aggravation is connected could mean that when offences and the nature of domestic abuse changes, that things get left behind. And so I wonder whether she would consider a more open-ended aggravation that's dynamic, that could attach to any offence. And so, what I've proposed is an aggravation on the basis of the definition in the Domestic Abuse Act. Would she consider a more dynamic one that doesn't list a finite number of offences?
Well, my honourable friend makes a very important point, and he's preempted my next section of my speech, because my government and I are actively considering how we can better identify domestic abuse offenders, and I want to reassure him that nothing is off the table. I would be happy to work with him and invite him to come and meet with me to discuss how best we do this in more detail. I know he has a similar agreement from my ministerial colleagues, and those he has already met to discuss this. Madam Deputy Speaker, tackling domestic abuse is a top priority for this government and a core part of our mission to halve violence against women and girls over the next decade. We are working across government. We are using every lever within our power to deliver against this ambition. Not more rhetoric, action. Deeds, not words. Thank you.
The question is that this House to now adjourn. As many as have that opinion say aye. Aye. The ayes have it. Order, order.